welcome to this video. I have here today with me Patrick Züst. He's working for the Flowable Solutions team and he did do a few migrations from other BPA software to Flowable already. Patrick, how do you approach that normally?
It's really nice to be here, and it's a really interesting topic, right? Because we have those global standards, BPMN and CMMN, that promise us to make migration as easy as possible and to minimize the lock-in. And I hope to give some technical guidelines today to illustrate what is actually easy to migrate and where there's still some migration and adaptations necessary.
So since you told it's easy, you have a laptop with you, I think now you need to show us.
Yeah, very happy to. I brought a very simple process along that was designed on a different workflow designer for a different workflow engine. So I can import that now to Flowable and we can see what is necessary to make it work on Flowable as well.
Okay, so you are importing our process. That process is a BPMN file. And once it's imported, we basically see what is part of that process. Maybe you can give us a really quick overview of what we have here.
Absolutely. So this process is all about credit card applications. So we see it only includes a couple of tasks that need to be executed. First, we have some input data where we need to check whether the address actually exists. Depending on the result, we want to calculate the credit score. And afterwards, depending on that credit score, we then execute a process to actually open that credit card, or we finish early.
Okay, so you mentioned based on some input data, but I think for the input data itself, that's not specified in the standard. Where's the data coming from?
That's a really good point. A lot of things are specified in the standard. These are basically the things that we see here, right? We see a lane, we see different paths, exclusive gateways, service tasks, even the conditions on those paths, they were taken over from the previous model. So a lot of things are here. But what you mentioned, the form to fill in the input data, that's not something that is written in a BPMN standard, but in fact, that's dependent on the respective workflow engine.
Okay, but I think for Flowable, it's a JSON document, so even if you have another format, you could generate that JSON and then import it.
Absolutely. Here, we do not have any proprietary format and try to keep it as open as possible. For this demo now, what I did is I already created a form with this input data, and we can also include it here in our application with another import.
Since you started with an empty app, you are now importing basically that form model.
Exactly. Now we have the process model. In addition to that, we also have the form model. And in that form, you can see that we just gather some simple data from our credit card applicant, like the first name, the last name, the address data, and so on.
And that address data is going to be important in a few seconds, since there you then need to go ahead and specify it for your check address.
Exactly.
Now, I mean, for me, it looks like when I execute that process, that this process is just going to work, since, I mean, it looks fine. Why do you not save and publish it? Or what would you do first, actually, before you save and publish it when you imported it?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It looks good, correct? Unfortunately, in the background, there are some things that are still missing. And we can validate the whether a process works as expected by clicking this button here to validate the model. And here we can see right away we have a red dot, so something is not right with this check address data service task.
Okay, so we need to do something there. Why is, I mean, that is expecting a delegate expression.
It's expecting something at least. And I actually went back to the original model, and there I saw that this should be doing an HTTP request to an external system. And the other workflow engine uses a different concept for that. It uses connectors. In Flowable, we just solved this differently. This is not depending on the BPMN standard, since the BPMN standard doesn't really define how such HTTP requests should be made.
So we are using typically a service registry. So how would you go about that?
Yeah, so there are different ways to implement this in Flowable. A very elegant one is a service registry. That means if we already have a specification of that external system we want to connect to, we can just generate such a service model based on that open API specification. And then very easily we can make that HTTP request.
So perfect. You just have 3 clicks and basically you have your service then afterwards, I guess.
That's the exact code. Yeah. You can see here that based on that API specification that I uploaded, we get back our service. And in that service, we have the endpoints that are available. We just have to do this once, and then we can use it across all our workflows if we need to.
How would you now use that service inside your process? What do you need to do for that?
Yeah. In order to make it available in our process, what we will do is we change our service task to a so-called service registry task, a Flowable specific concept. So here I'm going to switch that to the service registry task, and what I have to do next is I have to link the service model we just uploaded.
Okay.
So this is the validation API to validate whether an address exists. We can choose that operation.
Okay.
And for the input, we now have directly all the fields that were defined in the OpenAPI specification, and we can just reference the variables from the start form that we defined before. So if you remember, the variables in the start form had the same name as our input variables here. So this will be the street, the city, and
just basically define your input variables which you are having, that you can then use them basically to give them to the service, and you are retrieving back an output then at the end. And this output you are going to save now on your process, that you can use it then afterwards.
That's exactly what we're doing. As an output, we get back an indication whether that address is valid, and that variable is then stored in our process. And in fact, we will need it afterwards when we make that decision whether the process should continue to the next service task or not.
Okay, and you already remembered what the name is basically on that sequence flow, and that is why it is working.
That's exactly true. Yeah.
Is something missing that we can execute it? I mean, I see there's another service task. Do we need to do something for that one? I mean, it didn't show an error, so.
Didn't show an error, and the reason for that is that here we in fact have an indication of what should happen when we get to that task. Before we wanted to make an HTTP request. Here what we're doing is we call a Java delegate. Fortunately for us, we have this process where it was originally designed on a workflow engine that also supports Java delegate expressions. This is because we have common roots, right? There's the activity engine originally, and here we can really benefit from that synergy. So we do not have to do anything differently in the model. For the respective Java service task, we then need to change the imports, but that's something that I already previously did. And here we can just reference the Java class.
Okay, then let's press publish and see how it looks at the end. No?
Now we can switch over to Flowable Work. Flowable Work is the UI to interact with processes deployed on our workflow engine. And if I create now a new process here, I can of course also do this with a REST request or a Kafka event or whatever. But for now, let's do it manually. And if I create such a new process, I will see my start form.
So you basically now selected the process which is your parent process, the one we just imported, and not the one which just contains the start event.
Exactly. Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Here we can see the start form as we have defined it in Flowable Design.
Lucky you, it's already filled out.
Lucky us, it's already filled out. Wouldn't be interesting to look me type up everything. So next I'm going to submit this. And then the next few steps should be run through automatically. And you can directly see that, in fact, we didn't get an error. Everything ran through. We got it completed here. And we can even look at the history of that process, and we can see that all the respective service tasks were executed correctly.
So you executed now a REST request, you executed a Java delegate at the end, and you called another process.
Absolutely.
That is really nice. Now, I think when we take that and take one process, that is really nice to have it like that. But I mean, when you migrate from another engine, it's probably not your first process, and it's probably also a little bit larger than that one. How would you approach that?
That's a question we get a lot at the moment from our customers because they want to do it in a more systematic way. What we developed internally is a tool called Flowable Leap that enables you to make the leap from another workflow engine to Flowable. And
how would that work now from a approaching point of view? What would you do?
So Flowable Leap is also available publicly on the internet. We will link that in the description of the video as well. And what you can do here is upload your existing BPMN processes, for example.
That looks like you already have done that.
Exactly. That's the exact model that we previously imported in Flowable Design, that we adapted afterwards to ensure that there are no errors, no incompatibilities. And in fact, Flowable Leap directly here informs us about the incompatibilities that were found. So if we look at those two warnings, we can see that there's something that needs to be done in relation to the delegate expression.
Even with a long description in here, what needs to be done.
Exactly, with some tips of how this can be mitigated. This is related to the delegate expression.
It's the second service task basically in there, and the other one is then...
The other one is related to the HTTP request that was done, where we move over from a connector approach to a Flowable service registry approach. So you can see here how you can very proactively figure out how much migration effort is needed for a specific workflow to move over to Flowable. So
basically that you can use to estimate how much work you at the end need to do to then do the entire migration.
Absolutely, yeah. And typically what we do with customers, if they're interested in moving to Flowable, is we have a two-stage approach. So first stage is really a lift and shift, similar to what we've done so far. We take an existing workflow and make sure that it runs successfully on Flowable. Second step is then to really make use of all the additional features that Flowable offers, be it document generation, SLAs, and so on. So then it actually gets really
So it's basically a step-by-step approach. You first use Flowable Leap to estimate how much effort it is, then you start to migrate all your processes, and at the end you use all those cool capabilities which are coming with Flowable out of the box for you.
Absolutely, that's how we typically do it.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Patrick. Thanks for being here. And thank you everybody for watching, and see you next time.